The legislature is back in session. Going down the agenda, and then we'll go back. Senator Snickles, you're recognized on Resolution 215.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a motion to place Resolution 215 on the third reading file and be afforded an opportunity to speak on the measure.
Motion to place 215 on the third reading file. Any objection? You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Resolution 215-34 is relative to respectfully requesting the Federal Trade Commission to conduct a current review of trade practices and market concentration in the wholesale and retail fuel market on Guam in the context of the Federal Trade Commission mandates relative to the Exxon-Mobil merger of 2000, the year 2000, as enumerated in Federal Trade Commission docket number C-3907, decision and order. Before I go into the details of the resolution, Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize some of my colleagues as well as some of those who have been in this hall before us. The question of fuel prices here on Guam is not something that was initiated out of the blue by my office. It's actually been an ongoing question that's been asked over many years. It started with the late Senator John Salas, was carried on by Senator Tony Lamarena, further carried on by Senator Dennis Rodriguez, and twice initiated also by Senator Frank Uggan, all of whom made noble efforts to try and untangle this Gordian knot of whether the fuel prices we have on Guam is something that's fair with respect to what we would consider free market practices. All of our attempts have repeatedly gone unfulfilled, whether it's just by blatant unwillingness to cooperate or just a refusal to answer. And so when we approach this question, we did it from the same perspective initially as many of our people on this island do. It's very anecdotal. It's all based on observation. We see gas prices go up, they go up in lockstep. We see them go down, they go down in lockstep. You can drive all over this island and gas prices are the same everywhere at every retail fuel location. And while the initial and the gut reaction is, well, that's not right, something must be wrong, it's very difficult to get the information necessary for us to determine whether there is something wrong. So to try and resolve the question, my office initiated a very intensive research project that began a year ago. And we looked at so many different things in the course of trying to uncover whether or not this fuel market that we deal with at our gas pumps is something that is the norm, or is it something that needs to be looked at again? And throughout this resolution, you will see numerous references to all kinds of findings that we had with respect to the research that we did on this project. I'm going to go ahead and read through the resolution because I feel that after maybe 20 drafts or so, it could more properly capture the purpose than anything that I could possibly say otherwise. And it reads, be it resolved by Elisa Turanguahan, where in the year 2000, Exxon Corporation and Mobil Corporation consummated a merger subject to mandates enumerated by the Federal Trade Commission in its decision and order docket number C-3907, Exhibit A. Following that merger, the retail price of fuel has generally increased and decreased uniformly at an average yearly rate among the three leading fuel companies on Guam, which are IP&E Guam, Mobil Oil Guam, and South Pacific Petroleum Corporation. We have a chart that showcases that on Exhibit B. In the United States, Northeastern and Mid-Atlantic jurisdictions, fuel price action relative to the source does not reflect as large a margin disparity as fuel price action on Guam, with Guam fuel retailers publicly stating that Guam prices are incomparable to U.S. jurisdictions due to Guam fuel being sourced from Singapore refineries. We include an Exhibit C where there are numerous quotes from these fuel retailers stating such. Singapore fuel prices and Guam fuel prices, both relative to the price of Singapore oil, show growing price disparities that are inconsistent with the claims of Guam fuel retailers that Singapore prices are the cause for such price differentials compared to other jurisdictions, with the dollar difference between Singapore oil and Guam fuel increasing over time. From $1.07 in January 2000 to $2.28 in January 2016. As compared to the dollar difference between oil and fuel in other jurisdictions where the Federal Trade Commission mandated Exxon Corporation and Mobil Corporation to divest their assets. That was in the U.S. Northeast and Mid-Atlantic divisions. And it's referenced in Exhibit D. The Federal Trade Commission is a federal agency with the power to prosecute inquiries and investigate alleged unfair methods of competition and other antitrust violations, and utilizes the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, which is calculated by squaring the market share of each firm competing in the market and then summing the resulting numbers, to measure market concentration with a general consideration that markets in which the HHI is between 1,500 and 2,500 points to be moderately concentrated, and markets in which the HHI is in excess of 2,500 points to be highly concentrated. We reference this in Exhibit E of this resolution. In the year 1999, Exxon Corporation and Mobil Corporation announced their plans for a merger between their two companies, with the Federal Trade Commission determining that the Exxon-Mobil merger would raise the HHI in the fuel market, in the Guam fuel market, to 7,400 points, creating a highly concentrated market on Guam, stating specifically that, quote, "the market is subject to coordination," end quote. We reference this quote on Exhibit F, page 12 and 13 of this resolution. Just to digress a little bit, Mr. Speaker, in the previous whereas, under the HHI of what is considered highly concentrated, it's 2,500 points. When the Federal Trade Commission looked at our market based on this merger of Exxon and Mobil, it would have concentrated it almost 3 times over. As part of the finalization of the Exxon-Mobil merger, the Federal Trade Commission ordered Exxon Corporation and Mobil Corporation to divest retail and terminal assets in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic United States and Guam for the purpose of ensuring market competition. The Federal Trade Commission ordered that Exxon Corporation divest their Northeast marketing assets, Northeast United States marketing assets, and that Mobil Corporation divest the Mobil Boston terminal to a single acquirer within 9 months from the date of the execution of the merger. This is referenced in Exhibit A, pages 21 to 25, 32 and 33. The Federal Trade Commission ordered that Exxon Corporation divest their Mid-Atlantic marketing assets, Mid-Atlantic United States marketing assets, and that Mobil Corporation divest the Mobil Manassas terminal to a single acquirer within 9 months from the date of the execution of the merger. That's also in Exhibit A, pages 25 to 29, and page 33. The Federal Trade Commission ordered that Exxon Corporation divest their Guam assets to a single acquirer within 9 months from the date of the execution of the merger. This is also referenced in Exhibit A, pages 20 to 21, with Exxon Guam assets defined as the Exxon Guam terminal and all retail assets in Guam that are owned or leased by Exxon Corporation. That's referenced in Exhibit A, page 5. The Federal Trade Commission ordered the divestiture of Exxon Guam assets for the purpose of ensuring the continued use of the Exxon Guam assets in the same business in which they were engaged prior to the Exxon-Mobil merger, and to remedy the lessening of competition in the importation, terminaling, and wholesale and retail sale of fuel in Guam resulting from the proposed merger. We're not just making that up, Mr. Speaker. That is referenced in Exhibit A, pages 20 to 21. with South Pacific Petroleum Corporation acquiring the divested Exxon Guam assets, evidenced in Exhibit G. In the context of the Federal Trade Commission's decision and order, docket number C-3907, concerning the ExxonMobil merger of 2000, the subsequent pricing pattern of the 3 leading retail fuel companies on Guam post-merger may be indicative of non-compliance with the Federal Trade Commission's decision and order, SUPRA, particularly when compared to the price action in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic jurisdictions that were also subject to Federal Trade Commission orders. Whereas the current review of the Guam fuel market by the Federal Trade Commission can confirm whether the divestitures mandated by the Commission relative to the merger of Exxon Corporation and Mobil Corporation achieved the intent of the order to, quote, remedy the lessening of competition in the importation, terminaling, and wholesale and retail sale of gasoline in Guam resulting from the proposed merger, end quote. Exhibit A, page 21. Whereas the current review of the Guam fuel market by the Federal Trade Commission could result in an improved competitive fuel market for the people of Guam, including more competitive fuel pricing, if it is determined that current practices relative to pricing as affected by post-merger terminal and marketing activities are inconsistent with the outcomes intended by the Federal Trade Commission mandates. Now therefore be it resolved that Administrante Quatrin Legislature Guahan does hereby, on behalf of the people of Guam, respectfully request that the Federal Trade Commission conduct a review of current trade practices and market concentration in the wholesale and retail fuel market on Guam in the context of the mandates imposed on the ExxonMobil merger of the year 2000, particularly the trade practices of all market participants post-merger relative to the Commission's definition of a competitive marketplace as measured by the HHI Index and other relevant standards to measure market competition as determined by the Federal Trade Commission decision and order, docket number C-3907. To simplify, Mr. Speaker, when Exxon and Mobil were going to merge, the Federal Trade Commission said, hey guys, look, if you guys merge, your market's going to be too concentrated and it's going to lessen competition. If you're going to merge, we're going to require you to do several things. In the Northeast, you got to sell X, Y, and Z. In the Mid-Atlantic, you got to sell A, B, and C. And on Guam, you got to sell assets 1, 2, and 3. If you sell all of these, then there should be a more competitive market, and that should allow for this merger to go through. They complied with all of those requirements, but what happened after all of those assets were divested, at least here on Guam, the prices stayed the same. Arguably, they might as well have not been required to divest them. If everyone's price was going to stay the same, the assets might as well have just stayed with the merged entity. The specific assets that were ordered to be divested in each of these jurisdictions were so that whoever acquired them would have all of the assets necessary to compete with the newly merged entity. The asset divestiture order on Guam allowed for the acquiring company to have every single component they needed to be able to bring in their own gas and compete on the basis of price. But as the exhibits show in the resolution, that price competition never really materialized. As was mentioned in my opening, efforts were made to try and find out why over the years. The companies don't participate. They say that the data is proprietary. But the Federal Trade Commission has the power to go in and look. The Federal Trade Commission came in and looked in the year 2000 and rendered very specific findings and issued very specific orders in order to ensure that there would be some form of competition, or at least the ability for some form of competition here on this island with respect to gas prices. So what we're asking this resolution, Mr. Speaker, is we're not jumping to any conclusions. We're just asking the Federal Trade Commission to come back. We're asking them, can you come back? Can you take a look at what your orders were back in the year 2000? And can you take a look at what's happened since then? And whether or not this price action is consistent with the orders that you gave back then. And if it isn't, the ball's in your court, because your orders were for a specific purpose, and if the outcome was not achieved, were your orders followed? And they could either say yes, and they could either say no, and they can come back and they say, Guam, you got to deal with it. This is the fuel price market that you have, and based on our analysis, it is what it is. At least we can put the question to bed. Or they can come back and they can say, yeah, things got to change. This resolution doesn't make that determination, but it does ask for the appropriate regulatory authority to come in, access the information that we are unable to access from those fuel retailers, get the data together, do the study based on what they've already studied in the past, and render their findings. I humbly ask my colleagues to support this resolution. This is one of those lingering issues that we have been trying to get some kind of resolution on, and hopefully, by the passage of this resolution, we can get the answers one way or the other, and either get remedy or at least put the question to bed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Senator. Any senator wish to be heard on the resolution? Any senator wish to be heard on the resolution? Senator Snogestein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this resolution so that we can put this question to bed or find remedy. But the only thing I'd like to ask the sponsors that can we get a copy of the exhibits? We don't have the exhibits on the resolutions. If we can get copies of it, I was looking for it. Thank you.
There's over 100 pages. It'll be sent to you electronically. Senator Snogestein, there's over 100 pages. It'll be sent to you. Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to rise in support of this resolution, and I also want to acknowledge the efforts of our colleague who sponsored this resolution and the investment of the resources of his office in chasing down this issue. There are many things on island that we often think about, and we wonder why our circumstances are such that they are. And when it comes to something like this that affects everybody insofar as most people on island have to rely on modes of transportation for their daily living and to support their families, it does behoove us to at least attempt to chase down the answers. And so I just want to commend the author for investing the resources on behalf of the body to try to come to some understanding about what the situation is and how we can go about arrive at gaining some answers to the questions that many of us, not include the leaders, the industry people, but the common man who is affected by fuel prices. We often have these concerns, and so it's good that this type of legislation has a practical use and benefit to many in our community. So I just wanted to rise in support and to again thank him for devoting the resources that went into formulating this resolution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Lee.
Mrs. Masi, Mr. Speaker, I also rise in support of the resolution. I am proud to support it in the way that it was put forward and in the information that was gathered. I think that when we take the time to really thoroughly research and involve a lot of different people in this process, the outcome of what we can pass on the floor of this body would be a good one. And I want to commend the author of this legislation, especially in his opening remarks, how he kind of tipped his hat to all of the people who were instrumental in bringing this process forward over the years, over the many different terms of y legislature in Guam. And I think that's important that we continue to stand on the shoulders of those who came before us and do our very best to put forward good measures on the floor of this body, good bills, good resolutions, and I really look forward to seeing more of that in the future from all of my colleagues, and so I'm proud to stand in support of this resolution and doing the best that we can to provide some relief for our families and relief for the people of Guam. This is just Masi.
Thank you. Any other senator? Senator Espaldon and then Senator Argan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, too, rise in full support of this piece of legislation, this resolution number 215. You know, when he first broached the subject several months ago and talked about the approach that he was contemplating of taking, I knew that it would take a lot of research and a lot of in-depth analysis to try to understand how do you go about trying to understand why there is no price competition amongst the various fuel retailers here. This is actually a very creative approach to at least to see if we can peel back some of the layers to try to get an understanding of why all the prices are the same. It's a tough nut to crack. It really, really is. It's, again, as the good author acknowledged all the efforts prior, right, we still have the same situation in that there is no real price competitiveness, if even by 1 cent. Everybody's price is the same. And I guess the reason why it disturbs me, one of the reasons I should say, is that in the past when we have seen oil prices go up at the wholesale level, the Singapore price, the price or the world level, right? And as soon as you see that bump up, then you see the fuel prices at the gas station go up almost instantaneously as well. And of course, the rationale is, well, you know, the price per barrel has gone up, so now we have to charge that much more. And yet, on the other end of the spectrum, when the price per barrel of oil drops, there is no instantaneous drop in the price of fuel on this island. And the explanation is, well, we bought wholesale at a higher price, so we need to recover that price before we can lower our prices. And it seems to be two contrary explanations, because if, for example, they bought oil at a lower price and then there was an increase in the price per oil, you would imagine that the gas companies here would be able to maintain that price until they used up or sold all that gas, all that fuel that they bought at a lower price, and afford the consumers of this island to be able to at least avail of the lower price that they purchased at the wholesale level. And yet, on the other side, as soon as the price goes up, the explanation is, well, the price went up, so we now have to up our prices. This is definitely a very novel approach, and it really is only one way in which we might be able to start peeling back the layers of this onion in terms of why is there no price competition, and why do we constantly in this oil on this island have to deal with a non-competitive market for fuel? Because the previous speaker, one of the previous speakers is correct. Each and every one of us is affected by it. You know, not just those who go and gas up at the pump, but also that means that even the businesses who do business, say for example the wholesalers here on island of food products or whatever it may be, they are paying a higher price at the pump without any relief or without any ability to make a determination of purchasing a lower price fuel from one of the stations, because they also then would have to pass on their increased costs to the consumers. So it's not only at the gas pump that we are affected, but in everyday commodities that we do buy. And so I do commend and congratulate the author and really tip my hat to him for all the hard work and the analysis that he's done to bring this to light. It may be only one aspect or avenue in which we can start addressing the non-competitiveness of fuel prices here on this island. I rise in full support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Senator Reagan, you're recognized.
Buenas, Mr. Speaker and fellow colleagues. Mr. Speaker, I would like to stand and certainly extend strong consideration for the proposed resolution. And I say that and I commend the sponsor for looking at this particular issue, because it's not an issue that is foreign to yours truly. You know, there was one time when the cost of fuel per gallon almost reached $5 a gallon. And that's when the ire of many of our consumers out there, our drivers, really raised a lot of questions about why is it that the prices continue to go up, and that when one station in one particular location increases their prices, automatically you can anticipate that within the hour or within a day, within 24 hours, a service station, gas service station that is located right across the street increases their price accordingly. And likewise the reverse. When they drop their prices, the service station across the street and there are other service stations on island correspondingly drop the prices. And it brought into question the cost structure, the operational cost structure of some of these particular business establishments. And that's where my question came in, Mr. Speaker, because you can go into some of these gas stations and see that perhaps some of them have 1 or 2 or 3 personnel working at any one point in time. And then you go across the street, the other service station may have 1 less or 2 more employees working at any particular point in time than the service station across the street. And I'm bringing these factors up, Mr. Speaker, because it's part of the business cost operation. If a particular establishment is paying lease on the use of their facility, they've hired 5 individuals to be able to run that entire operation, and their cost of goods are being procured locally, the question is the service station across the street also acquiring their products and their goods from the same establishment so that they have the same cost structure? Do they have the same lease cost of the facility, or is the facility outrightly owned by the business establishment? So those are our business factors that came into question when in fact I had brought this issue, and I presented it to the Attorney General at that time, and I asked for an inquiry whether in fact there was an oligopoly arrangement that was being applied. And for our listeners out there, the definition of oligopoly is the market condition that exists when there are few sellers, as a result of which they can greatly influence price and other market factors. That's the business component. But let's turn it to our consumers who actually use the product. Mr. Speaker, it comes down to some of the comments that were shared to us by the previous speaker. Why is it that when the prices in Singapore, which is the primary source of all the fuel for the 3 companies operating on island, when their prices go up, obviously we can anticipate the prices on Guam to correspondingly go up. But they go up almost at the same time, Mr. Speaker, when we know that there are fuel tanks that still have some fuel, whether it's to last for a week or a last of 2 weeks, before you can anticipate possibly a price adjustment. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, at one point in time, when I had inquired about this whole situation, about the application of oligopoly here on Guam, where in fact one business establishment, once they adjust the prices upward or downward, certainly you can anticipate all the other service stations to be able to adjust their prices accordingly. I had pressed a communication, a letter to the AG's office at that time to please investigate it. Nothing, if very little, came out of it. So that's why I stand here, Mr. Speaker, and I commend the sponsor for looking at other ways in which this issue can be addressed. I have to admit that I haven't had the opportunity to read, like you said, over 100 pages of the exhibit in which some of these structures were required by the Federal Trade Commission and the merger of the Exxon and Mobil. But based on reaching out to the Federal Trade Commission, which has the authority to investigate, which has the authority to be able to come in and take a look at some of their price structure, even though the information is proprietary in nature, they have the authority to be able to conduct the appropriate research and investigation. And I believe that this could conceivably lead to some additional information that can be provided to our consumers so that they can also understand the price structures, and if in fact the findings reflect what the sponsor of this resolution is requesting, or if the findings reflect that because of the market that Guam provides, or the market on Guam exists, that it finds that there is an oligopoly, then certainly that's going to be an issue as it applies to the business conditions and the operations of these particular service stations. So, Mr. Speaker, it really comes down to the cost per gallon of our consumers out there, and just asking whether in fact, at least from my perspective, whether these businesses are operating in accordance with business requirements, and that an oligopoly to me does not exist. Because if that exists, it certainly brings into question a lot of other questions about the business environment on island. So, Mr. Speaker, I commend the sponsor for reaching out to the Federal Trade Commission and looking at another way in which these questions can be answered and responded to, and I certainly hope that the Federal Trade Commission will be able to respond accordingly and to conduct any necessary investigation. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard on the resolution? If not, you're welcome to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I deeply appreciate the sentiments of my colleagues. I definitely didn't do this alone. I have an amazing team, a really awesome team that I work with, and we put in a lot of hours, a lot of research, like trying to go one way, dead end, go another way, dead end, go another way, hard to reconcile, so let's just try and figure out, how do we get from A to Z? And that's why I opened by recognizing not only Senator Uggan and Senator Rodriguez, but all the other senators who've tried. This is a very, very tangled knot. Untangling it, this resolution doesn't even do that. But what it does do is it tries to provide the basis for the proper authority that can go in there and cut right through that Gordian knot and get into whether or not there is something that needs to be addressed. We even met with the Attorney General, their Consumer Protection Division. They've also offered their assistance as well. But again, something as complex as this, we really do need to reach out to those who can just get through all the hurdles and get to the answers. We're asking a very specific question, What happened to your orders? Can the Federal Trade Commission look at what's going on now, what's been going on since they issued their orders, and is this what you intended? So I'm grateful for the recognition by my colleagues. I want to immediately pass that through to my office and to my team. You guys are awesome. I humbly ask my colleagues for their support, and hopefully we can take one step forward on this issue that's really been having us all tangled up and really giving us a hard time to be able to give a solid answer to our people who deserve one. Because as was mentioned by the retiring speakers, fuel prices are pervasive. They are priced into everything. They're not just priced into what you put into your car. They're priced into the food you eat, the medical care that you get. They're priced into your power bill, your water bill. And while all those different fuel prices may have different sales channels, when we see our retail fuel prices at the pump fluctuating in a very particular way, it makes us really want to get to the bottom of it and find out what exactly is going on. On top of that, when we see fuel prices in the base, so different. When we research that question, you know, the presumption is, oh, it's on base, they probably bring in their own gas. They don't bring in their own gas. The presumption is, oh, it's on base, they don't pay any taxes, they pay the taxes. The presumption is, okay, well, it's on base, maybe they don't make a profit. They do. They pass through that profit into their morale, welfare, and recreation office to be able to provide activities for the troops. So if that operation inside the fence can get the same gas, pay the same taxes, run the same kind of operation, and make a profit at such a different price point, why are we paying so much more, and why are all the prices the same? We're not jumping to any conclusions of this resolution. We're just asking the appropriate authority to come in and get to the bottom of it. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity. I thank my colleagues for the support.
Thank you very much. On the motion to send the resolution to the voting file, any objection? Hearing none. Senator Morrison, you're recognized on 138.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been working closely with legal counsel. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to pass filed, and I will continue to work with legal counsel.
On 138?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll go back. Senator Atta, Bill 56.
Mr. Speaker, I move to place on file, pass on file bills 56, 74, 75, and 108.
Any objection? Hearing none. Thank you. How about 111? Is that still? How about 111?
Yeah, well, so I move to place bill. I'm going to make two motions here. First, I move to place bill 111-34 COR as amended by the Committee on General Governmental Operations and Federal, Foreign, and Regional Affairs into the third reading, and I would like to discuss it, into the third reading, and then I would move to accept a substitute version of Bill 111-34. And the substituted version has changes in it that was put in as a result of the recent public hearing or the recent hearing at the district court. So I have copies of the substituted version that will be passed around. So I guess we need to accept the substituted version.
There's a move to accept 111 as substituted. Hold on, I don't think we have it out.
It's just being passed out now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, you can go back up to it again, but after we finish with this, I'm done. No.
All right, there's a motion to accept this substituted version. Is there an objection? Hearing none.
Thank you. So, Mr. Speaker, just so that everyone, so that we're all making sure that we're talking off of the same bill, the bill you should be looking at is, reads on the upper left corner, Bill number 111-34 COR, as amended by the Committee on General Government Operations and Federal, Foreign, and Regional Affairs, and substituted on the floor.
You may proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, just as a matter of background, in 2004, a consent decree formulated by the U.S. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, was issued to rectify Guam's solid waste crisis. And that consent decree was approved by the U.S. District Court. However, Gov Guam's commitment was deemed unsatisfactory. And so in 2008, the District Court appointed a receiver to achieve compliance with that consent decree. And with this appointment of the receiver came the full power and authority to enforce the terms of the consent decree. When the U.S. District Court determines that the consent decree has been satisfied and that Gov Guam would have the capability to manage, operate, and sustain a compliant solid waste service and landfill, then it will return back the responsibility for the solid waste management back to the government of Guam. On April 2011, Public Law 31-20 was enacted in anticipation of the return of the solid waste management responsibilities back to the government of Guam. Public Law 31-20 established the Guam Solid Waste Authority, an autonomous public corporation similar to Guam Power Authority, Guam Waterworks Authority, and so by the enactment of Public Law 31-20, this Solid Waste Authority was created. Subsequent to enactment, the governor appointed and the legislature confirmed a 5-member board of directors, and the board has hired a general manager. It has adopted rules and regulations and has completed as much of the preparation as possible to assume responsibility from the receiver. The return back to government of Guam is now slated for December 31st, 2017. What is needed now is a bridge that would enable a seamless transition between the receiver and the Guam Solid Waste Authority. Hence, Bill 111-34 would serve as this bridge. So what does Bill 111-34 do? First, it mandates the Guam Solid Waste Authority Board to develop a compensation and classification plan to establish a basis for hiring classified employees. Keep in mind that the current workforce needs are being met through through contractual services with a private human resource company. So we really don't, so if that contract was terminated, the authority actually would not have any employees. So on Section 1 then, by establishing a compensation and classification plan, then this will start setting the foundations for the building up of the workforce within the authority. The second thing that Bill 111 does is that it protects the classified employees who were retained when the operations were turned over to the receiver. These were employees who were originally under the Department of Public Works Solid Waste Division. When the receiver was put in place, these employees were then came under the management of the receiver. And so Bill 111 just further iterates that these employees now, when they go back to the Guam Solid Waste Authority, will basically will continue. All existing employees on Section 2 there, Section 2A, all existing employees shall remain classified with no diminution in any benefits or rights as established in this chapter. So it just protects those employees. But then there's also another group of employees that's working for the receiver right now. And keep in mind that the objective here is to achieve a seamless transition so that we continue on with the stability of the operation. So there's this second group of employees that were actually hired directly by the receiver. There's about maybe 2 or 3 employees. I forget exactly what functions they perform there in the administrative, basically administrative functions. And so we cannot just bring them over as classified employees. So basically what we're doing is we're going to, Bill 111 allows to retain these non-government employees for a period of up to 3 years. Again, 3 years is a period that Bill 111 has set to allow the Solid Waste Authority to be able to transition and build its own workforce and still maintain stability. There's a third group of employees right now that's actually performing a lot of the solid waste functions. And these are actually a labor force that was hired by a private human resource company. And so the receiver has a contractual arrangement with this human resource company to provide laborers, to provide drivers for the dump trucks or for the solid waste trucks and whatnot. And so again, Bill 111 will allow to keep this contractual arrangement in place for at least up to 3 years. And finally, the bill would allow for the short-term operational contracts and obligations for services and procurement to remain in place for up to 3 years. Again, all this is in order to achieve some stabilization of services during and after transition and to allow the authority to get on its feet. The next thing that Bill 111 does is on Section 3 of the bill on page 3, it requires the Public Utilities Commission to conduct a management audit, basically to establish a baseline of what it is that we are receiving from the receiver, and to conduct that audit within 60 days from enactment of Bill 111, and to the maximum extent possible to be completed on or about December 30th, 2017. That again, the management audit will establish a baseline of what we are going to receive or have received from the receiver. The next thing that Bill 111 does is in Section 4, page 3, is that it allows for the current rates and charges to remain in effect. Now, it's necessary to do this because the rates, the charges and the rates, the service rates that we are currently assessing to the subscribers was actually established by the receiver. And by Guam law, the only ones that can actually establish service rates is the Public Utilities Commission. But Bill 111 would allow these rates to basically stay in effect, but it does require the Solid Waste Authority to file a rate adjustment petition within 180 days from the date of termination of the receivership. And basically what that does is it begins then the process for the Public Utilities Commission to be able to look at the service rates and determine whether it needs to be adjusted upwards or downwards depending on what cost factors are to be taken into account. And finally, what it does is it delegates to the Guam Solid Waste Board of Directors procurement authority for supplies, services, and construction. And so this is similar to what the other utilities have. Guam Power Authority, Guam Water Works, they also have been delegated by legislation procurement authority. And so these are pretty much the sort of things that Bill 111 does that would provide that for a seamless transition from the receiver to the GovGuam Solid Waste Authority. And this was formulated in collaboration with the board, and so and also from the Attorney General's office. Support for the bill. The Office of the Attorney General has given its support for the bill, the substituted version, and the U.S. District Court is aware of GovGuam's plan to effect this transition using Bill 111 as a bridge. Bill 111-34 is critical to GovGuam resuming the assuming the solid waste management responsibilities. So I would ask my colleagues to favorably consider the bill. Thank you very much.
Senators Nicholas and Senator Arkin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm actually going to need to reference your expertise as budget chair with some of these questions that I have that I'm going to be posing also to the author. On page 5, starting on line 3, the section 51A 121, acquisition of existing systems, employees, and debt. On the subsection B, basically it states that all working capital, cash, accounts payable and receivable, deposits, advances payable and receivable, all books, records, and maps, and all other rights, assets, operational obligations, and liabilities, agreements, and privileges of the authority or attributable to the authority. Basically, the authority shall assume all of these things. And I wanted to pose a question because I believe that there is a bond that was floated that is currently being paid out of the government coffers. And if we have the authority assume the liabilities, would that then be passing the bond obligation to the authority? And if we do that, would the authority then be required to raise rates in order to pay for that bond obligation? I ask for either the author or the budget chair to yield to the question.
Mr. Speaker, that concern was raised during the public hearing, and it's a very valid concern because obviously, if the debt service requirements if that burden is placed upon the Solid Waste Authority, it will increase the service rates that are being assessed to the subscribers. So that is why on line 12, the term operational obligations and liabilities was put in place. Operational in terms of if, you know, the short-term contracts that we have, whereas it's understood that the bonds is a long-term obligation, and it's really not considered operational. And so we've tried to distinguish it that way.
I do I appreciate the sponsor for answering the question. I do see the change here, and I understand the intent. The reason why I'm still posing the question, Mr. Speaker, is because I understand that this has been a very serious point of contention between the administration and the receiver about who's supposed to be paying for this debt service. And if we're writing in here that it's operational obligations and liabilities, will they come back and make the case that this bond is technically an operational obligation because of what was used to, what the bond proceeds were used for as operations? Therefore, it becomes an operational obligation. And if that's the case, then we just need to be very, very clear that by passing this, we are going to be exposing all of the ratepayers to an increase in rates if this language is not tight enough to prevent that. And basically what we will be doing is we'll be passing off the obligation from the government and passing through the obligation directly to the ratepayers through the authority by passing this measure.
I'm not sure how you can extinguish the obligation of whoever is the Solid Waste Authority, whether it's the receiver or it's the new authority. The bond was floated, and it was going to be dependent on the rates, and it was also going to be paid for by the backed by Section 30. And if there isn't sufficient funding, then it'll be backed by Section 30. But they're both there. That's how the bond was floated. It was a revenue bond, and I don't see how we can extinguish that unless you're going to forgive the new authority for the last 5 fiscal years, and just moving forward, they're still going to have to, when the new authority takes over, they still have the $12 million a year that needs to be paid. That was the obligation in the revenue bond. If they can't make that payment, then I guess we'll have to pay. Do it with Section 30, but it was a revenue bond.
But with respect to that bond, has the authority been paying that bond, or has the government been paying that bond?
Pursuant to the bond, Section 30 has been paying for the last 5 years, but the new authority is going to have to deal with this, and I don't see how you're going to extinguish that.
But the reason why I'm raising it as a question is because if the existing authority has not been paying it for the last 5 years and the government has been willing to pay it, then by doing this, we're basically going to require the new authority to pay it and not the government. And so just to be very clear, the rates are going to go up to pay for this because instead of us paying for it from Section 30, the ratepayers are going to be the ones paying for
Well,
the
somebody's going to have to pay for the bond.
Point
So
of
it either stays as revenue bond, which is what it was originally floated as, with the backing of Section 30, or it's going to, the new authority is going to have to live up to its obligation. And unless we just waive it and say, well, we'll assume it. And I'm not sure whether or not people are going to assume it. I see the chairman of, and then Senator, did you have wish to?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a point of information. Meeting with the GSWA board, they haven't been paying the bond since 2014. The receivership hasn't been paying that bond. So essentially, the inquiry also I asked them is how are we going to pay for this if it hasn't been being paid since 2014? And really their response was that they need to go out and they need to do an assessment, service rate assessment, to see the impact. And so yes, I believe that this is going to impact the customers, us. And so no, I thank the question from the previous speaker because we really seriously need to look at this. And you know, he's the finance guy, so if he could come up with a way that we can maneuver this, and you know, that would be a good thing for the people.
Senator Ada?
Mr. Speaker, the question is very valid, but I think that that question will be addressed at the time when the Public Utilities Commission then sits down to review the rate adjustment petition. That's when it's going to be addressed. At this point, we're just trying to transition from the receiver to GSWA.
That's correct.
Well, I just have several points to raise, Mr. Speaker. The first is that right now, the revenue bond, and I understand, don't get me wrong, I know how revenue bonds work. They're supposed to be the ones paying it, but they haven't been. Section 30 has been covering it. And so basically, the cost of that debt has been spread over every single taxpayer by virtue of the Section 30 money funding that. If it's funded by the ratepayers, that's not every single taxpayer. There's only a finite number of ratepayers. And so I'm unsure as to what the rate impact will be if that debt gets assumed. Is it going to go up $5?
Well,
Is it going to go up?
There's two debts that are assumed. They're assuming the debt prospectively.
Right.
And they also have an outstanding debt that's been accumulating retroactively. They've owed for the last several years. I'm not sure that anyone's going to say that they need to pay back $60 million plus the $12 million and announce a new rate that's going to pay for that. The government has already paid for the last several years, and that's done. But the new authority has to assume the obligation going forward, and they can make the determination what the rates are going to be. If the rate is going to be too high, as you so eloquently put it, 8 from here can say Section 30 will take it.
And I'm raising the question, Mr. Speaker, because the amount is unknown. And I mean,
No,
there's so many things that we need to factor. What will be the individual impact to the ratepayer if they assume the debt and they start paying it going forward? If they assume the accrued balance of the last 5 years and they amortize that into the ratepayer's payment, how much is that rate going to be? And I would like to understand that before I decide whether or not I'm going to say, you know what, assume all of it. Because when we say the authority needs to assume it, we're saying the ratepayer is going to assume it. The authority doesn't make its own money. And so if the authority is going to have to pay it, that means the ratepayer is going to pay it. Right now, the taxpayer pays it, but that means that it's spread out over every single taxpayer. But how much is the ratepayer's trash fee going to go up when we pass this? I don't think anybody knows, because basically what it boils down to is it's the debt service divided by the formula at which the trash fee is spread out.
Correct.
So does it go up 10%? Does it go up 20%? I don't know. And until I know, I'm not comfortable. Because otherwise, we may want to just continue carrying that cost, or we may want to completely have a conversation about a rate change altogether.
I don't believe that that should be part of this piece of legislation. That's a decision that the body's going to have to take at a future date.
I'm sorry?
That is a decision that this body will have to take at a future date. You can write off the obligation.
No, Mr. Speaker, because this act will have the authority assume the liability. We pass this, they will assume the liability. So we're not passing it forward at a future date. They're going to have to.
Yes. Whoever is the GSWA will have to assume the obligation of paying $12 million every year going forward, once January 2018.
All right, and I don't know what impact that's going to have on the ratepayer.
I don't either, but it is. And if they don't raise enough money for it, there is the backup of Section 30. So this legislature, starting in January, can tell the Solid Waste Authority, you don't have to worry about that, 12 million, we'll assume that obligation. It's like having your parents pay your mortgage.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you know, most of the bonds that we float are backed by the full faith and credit of the government when they're general obligation bonds. And I understand the Section 30 bond is a unique case with respect to this funding stream. We call it a revenue bond, but it's not purely one. A revenue bond is not backed by the full faith and credit of this government. So how does this work? They're assuming the liability, but the full faith and credit is stuck on the government side. It's still affecting our debt ceiling when it should be passed off as a revenue obligation on their side. Revenue bonds don't count towards the debt ceiling. So GPAs, bonds don't count, airports bonds don't count. This bond that we floated, because technically it wasn't a pure revenue bond in the sense that it was floated by the authority independently. It's technically a GO. I mean, it's technically a limited obligation bond funded by Section 30, impacting our debt ceilings. Very different. And these mechanics are creating a very unique situation, because this act will require them to assume the debt, but the debt is guaranteed by the government, unlike any other revenue bond that we have in the government. And that bond is also affecting the debt ceiling of the government, whereas every other revenue bond doesn't. And then by doing this, and we're forcing that liability onto them, I also don't know how much it's going to result in the ratepayers' fees going up. So for me, there's still too many questions specific to this. I first want to commend the author. This transitionary legislation is critical, but these are the fine points that, you know, whenever you have any kind of entity that's trying to divest or merge, you're going to have to work out these kind of details. And this is a detail that I'm still not fully comfortable with. I wanted to raise it as a question. And because this may impact ratepayers, you know, we have a PUC that handles rates. They will be handling these rates, but this is a very unique circumstance where if we pass this, the PUC is going to be required to raise rates to fund that debt. We don't know what that rate increase is going to be. We require all of these public hearings for PUC to raise rates in every other circumstance. If they were to float a regular revenue bond and rates were to go up as a result of that revenue bond, they would need to have hearings and everybody would need to understand what the potential impact would be. I don't know what the impact will be by forcing them to assume this liability and have them funded on the ratepayer side. And so I'd like to, I don't know if we can call in somebody to tell us what that impact's going to be, so that when we make a vote on this, we know what we're doing to the ratepayers. We know how much we're going to be jacking up their bills in the end. But until such time that we do that, I'm not comfortable, Mr. Speaker, and I wanted to raise these concerns for the record.
I understand, but at some point, we're going to have to make a decision on, is the government of Guam and 8 of you going to pass legislation that will assume the responsibility of the lead zone debt as a general obligation of the government of Guam, and it'll never go to GSWA. That's a decision that you're going to have to make.
I understand, and what I'm saying is that we don't have all the information in front of us. Because
and the thing is that we know that the rate will go up to cover the $12 million a year.
We don't know how much that rate will go up.
Yeah, but whatever the rate going up is going to cover the 12 million, is supposed to cover the 12 million, unless we assume it. In an analogy that some of us will understand, Mom and Dad gave us the house. There's an outstanding debt on it. You're supposed to assume it, and we know that it's $2,000 a month. Can you afford the $2,000 a month or not? It's going to be signed over to you, and if you don't, Mom and Dad's going to have to decide to protect their credit rating. They will pay the $2,000 a month. Is this an authority that's going to assume the $2,000 a month or not? You want title, you want the house. Either we're big kids now and we're an autonomous agency, or we're a government agency.
I fully understand that, Mr. Speaker. The responsible side of me wants to know exactly how much we're talking about. If Mom and Dad are going to make me assume the loan on the house, I want to know what the mortgage payment is going to be. That's all I'm asking.
And the mortgage
right
payment
now, we don't know,
is $12 million.
$12 million on a balance. That's like saying that the balance on the house is $150,000, but what's the monthly? And the monthly is determined, when you're talking about a mortgage, by the interest rate and the amortization. When you're talking about this rate, it's determined by the amount of the debt service divided by the amount of ratepayers, divided by whether or not certain ratepayers have a different rate structure. So we don't know what the monthly payment is going to be to the ratepayer. And that's all I'm asking for. I'm not saying are we big kids or not. I'm saying if we're going to do this and we're going to force this onto the ratepayer, what are we forcing onto them? Because we don't know. If they're going to assume the mortgage from Mom and Dad, what's the monthly payment going to be? We can say, yeah, there's a monthly payment. Do you want it or not? Well, yeah, that's only half of the equation, but how much exactly, Mom and Dad? That's what I'm asking, Mr. Speaker. And so I'm raising these concerns so that our people and this body can decide whether or not we're going to move forward on this, or if we want to put some kind of language in here that exempts that particular debt until a future date where we're going to pass future legislation to clearly have them assume it and have a public hearing and an adjudication process to do so. Or we can mandate, we can take out liabilities, or we can exempt that particular debt, and then in the future, mandate that the PUC assume that liability at a particular date, but first go through the necessary AAA processes in order to properly assure that the people are being informed as to what the impact is going to be. But right now, we don't know, and I'm not comfortable with that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Any other senator wish to be heard on the bill? Senator Argon.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, some of the line of questions or discussion that I would like to focus on is going to be consistent with the questions that have been asked by the previous speaker. Because anytime that we're passing legislation, we certainly need to ensure that the community understands what the financial implications may be should it result in increases and adjustments in rates and fees. So, Mr. Speaker, if I can ask the sponsor to yield, I just have a couple of questions with regards to the process that will be applied here. And my first question, and I'll present it to you, and it's up to the sponsor whether he would like to respond, is on page 3. there's a requirement, Section 3, there's a requirement for a management audit by the Public Utilities Commission. I believe that that's necessary because it would outline exactly what the personnel requirements will be and what the financial requirements will be to be able to fund the personnel / the other operational aspects. But the question I have, Mr. Speaker, is this proposal reads on line 17, such audit shall be initiated within 60 days from the date of enactment of this act, but then it continues on line 19, shall be completed to the maximum extent possible, completed by December 30th, 2017. So we know that it's been a few months since Bill 111 was introduced, so I don't know if the sponsor would like to push that date to the right a bit more to allow for an appropriate time frame for the management audit to be completed. But my line of question, Mr. Speaker, is on page 4, looking at the authority, shall prepare a petition for adjustment of rates and transmit the petition to the PUC. Transmittal to the PUC shall be accomplished no later than 180 days from the date of termination of the federal receivership. Now, it's consistent with the line of questions that have been asked, and my issue, Mr. Speaker, is that there's no requirement in this provision that this agency take their proposed rates and go out to the community and conduct a public hearing. Unless I miss the verbiage here, I don't see that part of this entire process. So I would like to ask the sponsor if he would consider, if in fact it's here, then please point it out. But I believe that any government agency that is proposing to adjust a rate to absorb the cost of that operation or to address other requirements of that agency really has a responsibility to be able to go out to the community first, share the proposal, and get feedback from the community in terms of the impact that that rate would have on our people or the ratepayers in this particular case, and whether the community can realistically absorb that additional cost. You just had an extensive conversation about a $12 million annualized debt service that in most cases, as we anticipate moving forward, will be absorbed by the Guam Solid Waste Authority. That's going to translate into rate adjustments. I would like to ensure that when any rate adjustments proposal is presented to our people, that they have the first option to review it in a public hearing, in a public forum, so that they can provide some appropriate feedback before it's transmitted to the PUC. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to pose a question to the sponsor if going through a public hearing process would be appropriate before any proposal is presented to the Public Utilities Commission, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the rate adjustment process is a well-established process under the Public Utilities Law, and it clearly spells out in there that when a utility files a petition for a rate adjustment, the utility is required to conduct public hearings, at least 2. We know from previous experience, Guam Power, Guam Water, they will conduct one in the north, one in the south, one at Central, and then they'll take all these findings and send it over to the Public Utilities Commission. The Public Utilities Commission, when it takes up the issue, must also duly notice its meeting when it discusses these issues. So there's going to be ample opportunity for the community to be able to provide their input.
Thank you very much, Senator. But Mr. Speaker, my understanding is that this is the interim provision that would establish the Guam Solid Waste Authority. My only question is there a provision here that requires, it doesn't even have that provision where it says consistent with the AAA process in Guam Code annotated subsection. So my question is that still a requirement? Because I don't see it in this proposal. Because he's absolutely right. The process for the other utility agencies is to go out to the community, conduct their public hearings. When they finalize their proposal, present it to the Public Utilities Commission for final consideration. But it's got to go back out to our people. So my question, my pointed question, is whether this provision has it that requirement for a public hearing, a AAA process, or is it in another part of the code that I'm not aware of as it applies to the Guam Solid Waste Authority? That's my question, Mr. Speaker.
The Vice Speaker is asking for a recess. Let's take a recess until 2 o'clock to give legal counsel and the parties an opportunity to get things together.